October 1944. Luzon. The air was thick with humidity, every breath pulling in the damp weight of the jungle. Cicadas screeched from the trees, and in a bamboo hut that served as a field headquarters, Japanese officers leaned over maps lit by kerosene lamps. Their uniforms were sweat-stained, their cigarettes burning down to ash in trays carved from empty shell casings. One officer, a captain from the 2nd Tank Division, read aloud from his journal with a smirk. The Americans have landed more of their light vehicles. They burn with a single shell. These are not tanks, they are a mockery. His words drew chuckles from around the room. To men who had studied German Panzers and Soviet T-34s, the reports of a thin-skinned American machine called the M18 Hellcat seemed laughable. They had seen American armor before. The Sherman was clumsy, its high profile easy to hit. Against the jungles of the Philippines, where the Japanese Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha could still maneuver, the notion of an even lighter vehicle seemed absurd. A colonel scoffed openly, "They are desperate. If this is their new weapon, it will last minutes in real combat." Outside, rain hammered on the tin roof, rattling like machine gun fire. Somewhere beyond the huts, soldiers marched on muddy roads, their boots sinking deep, rifles slung over their shoulders. For them, the war had become routine, ambushes in the undergrowth, long nights waiting for artillery that never came. The thought of facing flimsy American toys hardly stirred concern. But on the beaches not far away, another scene unfolded. From the gray silhouette of transport ships, the first M18 Hellcats rolled ashore. Their engines coughed, then roared with a tone unlike the heavy grinding of Shermans. Sleek, almost low-slung, with turrets that seemed too large for their hulls, the vehicles looked more like stripped-down sports cars on tracks than traditional tanks. American crews, bareheaded in the tropical heat, wiped sweat from their brows as they guided the machines onto muddy ramps. They knew the truth, their armor was paper-thin. A single hit from even the lightest Japanese anti-tank gun could ignite the vehicle. But that was not their purpose. The Hellcat had been built for speed, 50 miles per hour on open ground, faster than anything the Japanese possessed. It was not meant to slug it out in a duel. It was meant to dance, to appear and disappear before the enemy could react. Private diaries from American tank destroyer crews speak to that awareness. One sergeant wrote, "We don't rely on armor. We rely on our legs, on the tracks under us. If we stop, we die. If we move, maybe we live." Another recorded, "They laugh at us for being thin. Let them laugh. They won't laugh when they see how fast we are." The contrast could not have been sharper. In the jungle headquarters, Japanese officers traded jokes at the expense of the new arrival. Outside, under the dripping palms, American crews oiled machine guns, checked radios, and tightened track bolts. Each man knew what was at stake. The war in the Philippines had dragged into a grind of attrition, but the arrival of the Hellcat signaled a new tactic. It was not about strength. It was about speed and surprise. The jungle smelled of wet earth and smoke. Fires from earlier bombardments still smoldered in the distance, their embers glowing faintly under the night sky. Insects swarmed around the lamps, wings cracking against hot glass. The Japanese spoke confidently of their coming victories, convinced that their armor could swat aside whatever the Americans had brought. And yet, for all their confidence, unease flickered at the edges. Reports had filtered in, rumors of American machines moving faster than expected, appearing where no tank should be able to reach. The officers dismissed them as exaggerations. Soldiers always saw ghosts in the fog of war. Still, the doubt lingered. On the American side, there was no laughter. Crews sat quietly on their vehicles, their faces smeared with oil and grime, listening to the jungle noises with taut nerves. They checked ammunition again, then checked it once more. Their commander's orders were simple: move fast, strike hard, never stop. One American lieutenant captured the mood in his log: "They underestimate us. That is our only armor." The stage was set. In one camp, Japanese officers laughed at the absurdity of the enemy's machines. In another, American crews waited with engines warm, knowing their survival depended on velocity and nerve. It was only a matter of hours before those two worlds would collide. And when they did, the jungle would not echo with laughter. In just a few hours, the laughter in the jungle would turn to silence, and fear. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. October 29, 1944. Leyte. The morning air was heavy with the stench of wet earth and burning palm trunks. Rain had fallen most of the night, leaving the roads slick, narrow, and nearly impassable. Along those twisting jungle tracks, Japanese tanks crept forward, Type 95 Hago light tanks and heavier Type 97 Chiha mediums, their engines groaning as they fought the mud. Infantry slogged beside them, uniforms plastered with sweat and grime, bayonets glinting faintly when the canopy broke and shafts of light cut through. For the Japanese, this was familiar ground. They trusted their machines, built for the tropics, designed to slip through tight paths where bulkier American Shermans struggled. The Hago, though lightly armored, had been reliable in China and Malaya. The Chiha, armed with its 57mm gun, was considered adequate for the Pacific battlefield. The Americans, they believed, had nothing faster. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, like a distant storm. A vibration in the ground. The Japanese officers raised their hands, halting the column. Soldiers peered into the foliage. The noise grew, low, throaty, insistent. Not the heavy grind of Shermans, not the clatter of trucks. This was sharper, higher-pitched, like engines pushed beyond reason. Out of the jungle burst something no one expected. A column of M18 Hellcats tore onto the road, engines screaming, treads flinging mud high into the trees. They moved at speeds that seemed impossible for tracked vehicles, weaving between palms, swaying as if they might tip yet never losing balance. At 50 miles per hour, they closed distance faster than infantry could react. One American commander described it later in his report, "We came at them so fast they didn't even traverse their turrets. By the time they turned their guns, we were already behind them." The Hellcats did not fight like tanks. They darted forward, fired, then disappeared into cover before the Japanese could respond. Their 76mm guns spat flame, shells slamming into the thin armor of Hagos and Chihas, bursting them open in sprays of fire and metal. For the Japanese, the experience was surreal. Tank duels in the jungle had always been slow affairs, machines lumbering toward each other until one found its mark. But this was different. These American vehicles did not approach head-on. They streaked across the flanks, circling, vanishing, reappearing like predators. A Japanese diary entry recovered after the battle captures the moment. "We thought they were trucks at first, moving so fast. Then they fired, and our tanks were aflame. We aimed our guns, but they were gone, already behind us." The battle became chaos. Japanese gunners shouted orders, desperately cranking their turrets, but the Hellcats were always in motion. Infantry fired rifles and machine guns at the blurred shapes, bullets sparking harmlessly against thin armor. The American crews, exposed above their open turrets, shouted back and forth, guiding their machines with nerves of steel. Speed was their only shield. Private diaries reveal the tension. One Hellcat gunner wrote, "We knew a single hit would turn us into fire. But the speed, my God, the speed, kept us alive. We didn't stop, not for a second." On that narrow jungle road near Ormoc, the old logic of armored warfare dissolved. The Japanese had expected weight and armor to decide the fight. Instead, they faced machines that fought like lightning, appearing and striking before resistance could form. By afternoon, the road was a graveyard. Smoking hulks of Chihas and Hagos lay tilted in ditches, their crews lost inside. Burnt palm trees marked the line of retreat. American Hellcats idled at the crossroads, their crews climbing down, faces streaked with oil, exhaustion visible in every movement. One officer of the 2nd Tank Division, captured weeks later, admitted in interrogation, "We laughed when we first heard of them. We stopped laughing. They were not tanks. They were something else, too fast, too sudden. Like fighting against thunder. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Japanese doctrine had prepared for duels of armor, for slugging matches where endurance and sacrifice might prevail. But against the Hellcat, endurance meant nothing. The battlefield belonged to whoever moved faster, whoever struck first. That day, American crews learned the truth of their machines. Thin armor meant vulnerability, yes. But speed, raw, blinding speed, was its own kind of weapon. For the Japanese, the realization came too late. That day, on the roads of Leyte, they faced not a tank, but lightning on tracks. November 1944. Luzon. The mountains loomed hazy in the distance, their slopes covered in dense jungle, while the valleys below were carved by roads broken by monsoon rains. The American advance had begun in earnest. Convoys stretched for miles, trucks grinding forward in the mud, infantry marching with rifles slung low. At the very front, the Hellcats prowled, engines howling as they leapt over potholes and swerved past stalled vehicles. To the Japanese, their approach seemed unreal. From high ridges, scouts watched the American columns snake forward. They expected to see Shermans, bulky and predictable. Instead, thin silhouettes appeared at the head of the line, moving with unnatural speed. One Japanese officer wrote later, "We saw them rise over the crest of the hill. We aimed our guns. But when we fired, they were already gone, moving too quickly to follow." The Hellcat was not invincible. Its armor was paper, just half an inch in places. A single direct hit from even a light anti-tank gun could tear it apart. Crews lived with that knowledge every moment. The diaries and letters of tank destroyer men speak of the weight it placed on their nerves. Sergeant James Waller, 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, scribbled in his notebook, "We've lost 3 crews this week. When the shell hits, there's no second chance. It burns quick, like striking a match. We bury what's left in a bag, and then we climb back in our own machine, waiting for the same." Yet despite the danger, the speed saved more men than it doomed. Hellcat drivers kept their machines constantly in motion, darting from cover to cover, never presenting a target for long. To stop was to die. To move was to gamble, and often to win. The roads of Luzon became arenas for these gambles. Convoys of Japanese tanks, advancing cautiously through villages and fields, found themselves ambushed by shadows that seemed to come from nowhere. The Hellcats did not meet them head-on. They appeared on flanks, sprinting across rice paddies, sending water flying in arcs behind their tracks. They fired once, twice, then disappeared into tree lines before Japanese gunners could even traverse their turrets. One captured Japanese soldier described it bitterly, "It was like chasing birds. You think you see them, but when you point your rifle, they are already in the sky." For the Americans, the exhilaration was mixed with dread. Tank destroyer crews described moments of triumph, knocking out a Chiha with a single shot from the flank, followed almost immediately by terror as enemy fire ripped past them. One Hellcat commander recalled, "We were laughing, shouting after we got him. Then a round slammed into the road in front of us. Shrapnel tore into the hull. We barely made it back." The laughter stopped fast. The Hellcat's design philosophy was both genius and cruelty. It demanded nerve, constant movement, and the willingness to risk everything in exchange for surprise. Many crews did not survive that bargain. American after-action reports from Luzon list the losses in dry language: 2 M18s destroyed, enemy anti-tank fire. Crew casualties, total. But the survivors remembered the screams, the rush to drag comrades from burning steel, the smell of fuel igniting in seconds. Still, the machine proved its value. Japanese officers reported entire columns delayed by mere handfuls of Hellcats. On one narrow road near Bayambong, just 5 vehicles forced an enemy battalion to halt for nearly a day. By constantly shifting position, firing from unexpected angles, and vanishing, they convinced the Japanese they faced a much larger force. A.U.S. officer wrote in his field report, the enemy still does not understand. They look for tanks. We give them speed. Their doctrine cannot keep up. That inability to adapt spread panic. German advisors had once told the Japanese that armor battles were contests of endurance, of steel against steel. But on Luzon, endurance became meaningless. The Americans had embraced a new principle, that victory came from velocity, from the ability to move faster than the enemy could think. The price was high. Cemeteries filled with the names of tank destroyer men, many no older than 20. The Hellcat saved armies but consumed its crews. One gunner's final letter home, recovered from his belongings, captured the paradox: we ride in machines that feel like death traps. But when the engine roars and we fly past the trees, it feels like freedom. Maybe that's why we fight, because if we slow down, we're already dead. By the end of November, the Japanese understood that their armor could not match this new reality. Yet they had no answer. Their tanks, already outdated, became easy prey to machines that refused to stand still. And so, in the jungles and valleys of the Philippines, a new kind of war revealed itself. The Japanese had prepared to fight tanks. Instead, they found themselves fighting speed itself. The Hellcat forced them to confront not the present, but the future, a future where battles would be won not by who was heavier, but by who was faster. January 1945, Luzon. The jungle was a cage. Fog drifted between the trees, hanging low like smoke from invisible fires. Vines twisted down from branches, roots jutted out of the mud, and the narrow paths were choked with fallen leaves slick with moisture. Japanese officers believed this ground would trap the Americans. Heavy tanks could not maneuver here, not among cliffs, ravines, and trails barely wide enough for a cart. Their artillery was carefully registered, sighted to strike the road the moment a vehicle appeared. For weeks they had waited, confident that steel and patience would be enough. The first sound broke that certainty. It came as a vibration through the soil, then a howl that built into a scream of engines. The defenders readied themselves for Shermans, for the clumsy silhouettes that had lumbered forward on other islands. Instead, out of the mist burst the Hellcats. They came in sudden bursts of motion, low and fast, flinging mud high into the canopy. Their profiles looked almost fragile, but their speed was a shock. They didn't creep along the path, they darted off it, smashing through bamboo and vines, too light to sink, too quick to catch. Japanese gunners swung their barrels frantically, but the Hellcats refused to stay where they were expected. They fired from the edge of clearings, shells slamming into bunkers and dugouts, then vanished again into the haze. By the time an artillery crew aligned its gun, the target was gone. One report later intercepted captured their despair: enemy armor moves too quickly. We prepare to fire, but they disappear. Our shells land on emptiness. For the Americans, it was as dangerous as it was exhilarating. Inside the thin-skinned machines, the crews fought with every nerve stretched to breaking. A single hit could ignite them in seconds. Drivers hunched over the controls, eyes wide, knuckles white on levers slick with sweat. Commanders shouted through the roar of engines, voices hoarse, ordering their men to press harder, faster. To pause was to die. A gunner from the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion later wrote in his journal, "Every shadow looked like a cannon muzzle. But the faster we went, the safer I felt." It was madness, but speed was the only shield we had. The jungle, thought to be a fortress for the Japanese, became a stage for illusions. The roar of an M18 engine echoed wildly, making two machines sound like 10. Infantrymen heard the blasts of 76mm guns from different directions and believed themselves surrounded. Villagers hiding in the ruins whispered afterward that the Americans' tanks seemed to fly like spirits, appearing and vanishing without warning. American infantry followed cautiously in their wake. They found pillboxes shattered from behind, Japanese machine guns silenced before they could sweep the roads. The soldiers began to call the Hellcats ghost cars, machines that left only smoke and echoes as proof they had passed. To them, the destroyers were more than vehicles, they were hunters clearing the way, striking faster than human eyes could track. But the cost was undeniable. Burned hulks sometimes smoldered along the paths, blackened skeletons of machines that had pushed too far. Survivors dragged charred bodies from turrets, coughing on smoke, eyes burning with grief and rage. They buried their friends in shallow graves cut into jungle soil, then climbed back into their own fragile machines, knowing they might be next. Still, the effect on the Japanese was devastating. Whole positions collapsed not from overwhelming firepower, but from disorientation. Units trained to resist Shermans with deliberate fire now faced enemies that fought like phantoms. A diary fragment found on a dead Japanese lieutenant read, "We waited for beasts of steel. Instead, shadows came. They struck from mist and vanished. We fired until our barrels glowed, but hit nothing." By mid-January, entire lines on Luzon that had been expected to hold for days dissolved in hours. The Americans advanced through fog and foliage, not by brute strength, but by velocity. For Japanese commanders, the realization was bitter: fortifications, artillery, even courage counted for little if the enemy refused to stay still. One officer captured weeks later admitted, "We mocked them. We called them weak. But in the jungle, they hunted us. They were not tanks. They were ghosts." The laughter that had once filled Japanese camps was gone. It had been swallowed by the jungle, drowned by the roar of engines that refused to be pinned down. They no longer believed they were fighting tanks at all. They believed they were being stalked by ghost machines. February 1945, Manila. The city was already dead when the battle began. Whole districts lay in ruins from bombardments, streets choked with rubble, windows blown out, roofs collapsed. Smoke hung low over the avenues, thick with the smell of charred wood, plaster dust, and something darker, burnt flesh carried on the breeze. Civilians hid in cellars, pressed against damp walls, whispering prayers through the tremors of artillery. For the Americans, advancing into the capital meant house-to-house combat. For the Japanese, it was supposed to be their final fortress. Among the shattered blocks, the Hellcats moved in. The M18 had been designed for speed in the open, but in Manila it became something else: urban lightning. Crews pushed their machines through narrow lanes, engines echoing between stone walls, turrets swiveling to cover alleys where ambush might wait. They accelerated into open intersections, fired, and darted back into cover before Japanese guns could answer. One American officer later described it: "We chased their tanks through the streets the way hunters drive beasts. We struck, pulled back, then struck again. The city was a trap, but not for us, for them." Japanese tanks, the same Hago and Chiha models that had once held ground in the jungle, now looked pitiful against the speed and firepower of the Hellcats. Their guns cracked, but shells slammed into walls or shattered corners of buildings long after the American machines had vanished around another block. The slow traverse of their turrets, once merely a handicap, now became a death sentence. Reports from Japanese commanders, later intercepted, carried despair: "Their machines move faster than ours can follow. We cannot stop them. Each street becomes another ambush." The Americans exploited every advantage. Hellcats dashed across boulevards, blasted holes in barricades, and withdrew before counterfire. Infantry followed, clearing resistance pocket by pocket. To the foot soldiers, the tank destroyers were the hammer that cracked open each defensive knot. The crews inside felt the pressure keenly. The city offered no room for error: every corner might hide a gunner with an anti-tank weapon, every basement a last-ditch squad with grenades. A Hellcat driver wrote afterward, "The noise was unbearable. Engines, gunfire, collapsing walls, it all blended into one roar. I gripped the levers so hard my hands cramped. We flew down streets littered with broken glass, and every time I thought, if we slow even a second, we're finished." Fires lit the night sky. Blocks burned uncontrollably, throwing up showers of sparks that drifted across ruined churches and government buildings. Civilians ran through the streets carrying bundles of possessions, colliding with soldiers, vanishing again into the chaos. For Hellcat crews, the line between battlefield and city vanished. They fought in a place where families still hid in basements, where the echoes of children's cries mingled with the thunder of tank guns. The Japanese clung to an older truth, that the spirit of the warrior could overcome material weakness. But in Manila, courage was crushed by velocity and firepower. A bunker full of determined soldiers meant little when a 76mm shell shattered the concrete before they could fire a shot. A tank commander's discipline meant nothing when his machine turned into a burning coffin after a single strike from the flank. Witnesses remembered scenes of chaos. Japanese tanks retreating down avenues, only to be pursued and destroyed like prey. Hellcats bursting through smoke, firing once, and vanishing into the ruins. Civilians saw them streak past shattered windows, flashes of steel and thunder, as if the machines themselves were alive. The effect on Japanese leadership was brutal. Generals expected to grind the enemy down in slow street fighting. Instead, their messages back to headquarters carried panic: we cannot maneuver. They strike and withdraw before we react. Our tanks are useless. Some officers urged counterattacks, convinced that sacrifice could slow the Americans. But every charge ended the same way: columns trapped by rubble, flanked and shattered by Hellcats moving too quickly to pin down. For all the rhetoric of honor, the battlefield was cold arithmetic. Speed and fire decided who lived and who burned. The city that had been their fortress turned into a maze of traps, each sprung by the very machines they had once dismissed as fragile. For the Americans, every block cost blood, but the Hellcats kept momentum alive. They shattered counterattacks before they could form, broke strongpoints that would have slaughtered advancing infantry. One lieutenant concluded in his report, "Without them, we would have lost hundreds more. They were the spearhead we needed." By the end of February, Manila lay in ruins, its defenders broken. What Japanese generals had imagined as proof of their spiritual strength instead became evidence of their collapse. Month by month, battle by battle, their tanks, once symbols of strength, were reduced to stationary targets for mobile American guns. Spring 1945, the Philippines. The last battles came with less noise than the first. By March, the Japanese had been pushed into pockets of resistance scattered across Luzon and the Visayan Islands. Their supply lines were broken, their tanks reduced to relics hidden in groves or dug into the earth as immobile bunkers. What had begun with confidence now looked like exhaustion. Villages lay abandoned, roads littered with husks of machines burned black. The jungle, once alive with gunfire, was eerily quiet except for the distant crack of rifles and the groan of wounded men. Among the wreckage, the Hellcats still moved. Their paint was scratched to bare steel, their engines coughed after months of strain, but they rolled on. Crews rode with faces drawn, many with bandaged hands or arms, the price of battles already fought. Yet their machines had done what seemed impossible: they had cut through defenses once thought impenetrable, they had chased enemy armor into extinction. An American report summed it up with dry finality: enemy armored resistance negligible. Remaining tanks destroyed or abandoned. Mobility of M18 units essential to conclusion of operations. But inside those sterile lines lay months of terror and sacrifice. A Hellcat commander, in a private letter written after Luzon was declared secure, captured the truth more clearly: we lost friends in every fight. A thin hull was no protection when luck ran out. But we knew our speed saved not just us, but thousands of infantrymen who would have died clearing bunkers without us. The machine was our curse, but it was also our salvation. The spring air smelled of smoke and wet soil. Across the plains, columns of refugees trudged back to ruined homes, moving past the skeletal frames of Japanese tanks left to rust in the sun. Chickens picked at the mud near twisted metal, children stared at the burnt hulks with wide, silent eyes. For them, the war had ended in silence, but the images would remain. On the Japanese side, silence replaced mockery. Prisoners captured in the final months no longer laughed about the toy tanks. Instead, they spoke with a kind of grudging respect, as though describing something unnatural. One officer admitted during interrogation, "We laughed at your machines when they first appeared. We called them weak. But speed was your weapon. It was the one we could not defeat." There had been counterattacks in those last weeks. Groups of tanks and infantry still surged out of hidden ravines, hoping to break through, to stall the inevitable. But they ended the same way every time, with the sharp crack of 76mm guns, the screech of engines as Hellcats outflanked them, and then the roar of machines bursting into flames. A corporal from the 637th remembered, they tried to hold the line with everything they had left. But it was like watching waves crash against a cliff. Every rush ended in smoke and silence. The jungle bore witness to this change. Charred hulks of Type 95s and Chihas lay beside roads where they had tried and failed to ambush the Americans. Shell holes gaped in their armor, evidence of strikes from guns that fired and then vanished before a countershot could be taken. Birds nested in the burned frames, nature reclaiming the carcasses of machines that had once been symbols of strength. For American infantry, the Hellcats were more than machines, they were the shield that allowed them to advance. Soldiers told stories of watching the fast-moving vehicles dart into kill zones, drawing fire that would have torn apart platoons. They remembered the moments when a flash of muzzle fire in the mist was answered instantly by a Hellcat shell, saving men who had been seconds from slaughter. But the crews themselves carried a different memory. They remembered the fragility of their armor, the heat when shells passed too close, the screams when one of their own was hit. They knew that for every enemy tank left in ruins, there was an American grave filled nearby. And yet, even with that cost, the truth was undeniable, their speed had given the army the edge it needed to finish the campaign. The contrast was stark. The Japanese had believed spirit would overcome technology, that discipline could defeat steel. But the war in the Philippines proved otherwise. The battlefield had been rewritten. Speed, not weight, decided the fight. Maneuver, not mass, shaped victory. By the spring of 1945, the laughter that had once echoed in Japanese field camps was gone. It had been consumed by months of battles where every advantage they thought they held had been stripped away. In its place was only the recognition, spoken reluctantly, but undeniably, that their enemy had mastered a new way of war. When the guns finally fell silent, the Hellcats rested too. Crews climbed down from machines scarred and weary, touching the metal that had carried them through fire and loss. Some wept for the friends they had buried along the way. Others simply stared at the horizon, too drained to speak. One Japanese diary, recovered from the ruins of a bunker after the last battle, offered the most fitting epitaph: "We laughed at them. We believed their weakness would be our strength. But in the end, we were wrong. Their weakness was their strength." And so the circle closed. Their laughter had vanished into the jungle. Because the Hellcat had shown that sometimes thin armor and light weight are not flaws at all. Sometimes, they are the path to victory.